Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here despite metro failings and heavy rains. The question with which I'm going to start is indeed the question you mentioned, Jan, and thank you for your kind introduction. Is the question, is it a spring or is it a revolution? Where does the word spring come from? The first time it was used was actually in 1848. It was called the revolution then going up and down in Europe was called the Spring of Nations, People's Spring, when people were defending ideas like liberalism in Europe, nationalism and socialism. It was also the year when Karl Marx published his Communist Manifesto. A lot was going on, but in the end it was considered a failed revolution, hence they called it a spring. The second time the word spring was used was 1968, the Prague Spring. As you know very well, I mean, the Russian tanks stopped in Prague the reforms by Alexander Dubček and his government and made an end to what was then maybe a revolution in Eastern Europe. Closer to the Arab Spring was 2005. In 2005, a referendum agreed in Iraq on their constitution. So the first time they had a constitution that later led to the first elections in Iraq ever. Secondly, there were presidential elections in Egypt, also for the first time, when Mubarak was challenged by Ayman Noor, who was of course later jailed because he was challenging Mubarak. But in the same year, as you probably remember, Rafiq Hariri, the prime minister of Lebanon, was assassinated by Syrians. This led to a Sadr revolution, to kicking out the Syrians out of Lebanon, which was called a revolutionary moment. But all in all, people were pretty cynical about change in the Middle East, so that's why they called it Bush's Arab Spring. So now we're going to 2011. In Tunisia, on the 17th of December 2010, people came on the street after one guy, Mohammed Abu Zizi has been immolated himself, put himself on fire after an incident with the police. So people were hitting the street, and again some cynical remarks were uttered. It was on the 6th of January, which was even before Ben Ali fled the country, which he did on the 14th of January 2011, that Mark Lynch, a well-known commentator, wrote in Foreign Policy, oh, maybe we can see here the beginning of Obama's Arab Spring. A cynical remark that was made in a better way by El Baradei a bit later in Der Spiegel, when people started to come on the street in 2011 on 25 of January. I would like to make the case for calling it a revolution and not a spring, because springs do end, revolutions don't end that fast. In order to do that, I've taken a famous book of Brinton called The Anatomy of Revolution, written in 1965. In this book, Brinton, a professor from Harvard, is comparing 4 important revolutions: the Glorious Revolution in England, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Russian Revolution. And he says that each one of these revolutions actually went through 4 or actually 5 phases. The first one, phase 0, is the revolution itself. And after that, which he describes slightly in the book, is a short period of honeymoon. People are being happy and so forth. Phase 1 is the rule of the moderates. Phase 2 is a reign of terror and virtue. Phase 3, called Thermidor, or the counter-revolution. And phase 4, the end of the revolution. He bases his ideas, of course, on the mother of all revolutions, which is the French Revolution. Let me go quickly through the French Revolution, because I believe for most people it's a long time ago that they have studied it. Phase 0, revolution. You know that the king, Louis XVI, called the General Estates together in order to find money because he was going bankrupt because of wars he was doing. But the third estate, the estate of the people, there were three estates, the people, the nobility, and the clergy. And the estate of the people, who were representing more than 25 million, so almost 85 or 90% of the people, had the same amount of votes as the other three estates. So they said, that's not okay, we're going to call a National Assembly and later a National Constituent Assembly on the 9th of July, 1789. That act alone created an atmosphere of revolution which pushed the 954 people to liberate La Bastille, where exactly 7 prisoners were still there, one of which was Marquis de Sade, who probably would better have remained in La Bastille. Anyway, this revolutionary moment, I don't mean this, it's good he was liberated. This revolutionary period was followed by a short period of honeymoon, after which the moderates and phase 1 came into power. Who were these moderates? I mean, these were not grand revolutionary types, as you would think, but people like Marquis de Lafayette or Comte Mirabeau. So they were still nobility who shared revolutionary ideas. They stayed in power from 1789 until 1792. They were called les Girondins. So they started with a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. They declared a constitutional monarchy and tried to have a period of moderation, of evolution towards a more democratic France. They also had a new constitution. But then phase 2 kicked in, the Reign of Terror. A group of people called les Jacobins didn't agree with this moderate phase, and they kicked them from power and took power themselves in August 1792. The leader of the Jacobins was Robespierre, Maximilien de Robespierre, called the Incorruptible. And what he did first was abolishing the monarchy, declaring a republic, a very revolutionary act, of course. But because of being incorruptible, he asked that the entire country would be incorruptible. And after taking power with people like Marat, Saint-Just, Danton, all very revolutionary people, they started to execute all people who were not corruptible, people who did not follow their ideas, people who they just didn't like. 19,000 people died by the guillotine, which is rather massive. So, and of course, after only a short period of time, in 1794, there was a counter-revolution. The entire assembly kicked Robespierre out and his friends like Saint-Just. They executed him and they started a new, more moderate regime, which was a counter-revolution, which is called the Thermidor, with again freedoms were installed, but at the same time also the White Terror was installed. Everyone who had cooperated with Robespierre and his friends were eventually persecuted. A directorate was installed, and also the war, which was started by Robespierre in the Vendée, cost 200,000 people's lives. 200,000, I think that's an important figure. So the war was stopped, but within the directorate there was a coup within a coup within a coup all the time, until Napoleon took power on the 18 Brumaire, 1899. Sorry, it was 1899, ending all this, installing a consulate first, then making himself the first consul, then consul for life, and then in 1804 he became Emperor of France. After the revolution, first of all, it's interesting to know that every single phase of the revolution, so always had a new constitution, with always a referendum, where the constitution was approved by more than 95%, sometimes 99.9%, almost the percentage that Sisi will get after tonight. France, however, had the one regime change after the other, from republics, kingdoms to new empires, and it was only in 1875, after 14 constitutions, that the Third Republic of France became the first stable democracy after France. So this is 86 years after the French Revolution was the first moment when there was a stable democracy in France. Let's take this comparison to the Arab Spring. First of all, phase 0. Revolution. Of course, contrary to the revolution in France, here we are talking about revolution in 9 different countries, and the revolution spread like fire. 17 December, it started in Tunisia. Ben Ali himself fled on the 14th of January to Saudi Arabia, and that kicked the start of protests in Jordan. Then started the 25th of January in Egypt, 3 February, Yemen, 17 February, Libya, 19 February, Bahrain. By the way, on the 11th of February was a moment that Mubarak left, which was an earthquake moment, for nobody believed that was ever possible. Then it went to Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and finally in Syria on the 15th of March. You all know the pictures, you have all seen the beautiful pictures of these revolutionary days, these honeymoon days. But not everywhere there was honeymoon. In Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain, the army crushed the protests immediately. In Syria, pretty quickly, and later on in Libya and Yemen, it turned into war. In Morocco and Jordan, they got the protests canalized by promising reforms, not by accident, by 2 kings who are descendants from the Prophet, so who had a huge authority in their own country. But in Tunisia, Egypt, and also in Yemen and Libya in the beginning, there was this honeymoon period. And I remember I was in Cairo in March 2011, and around Tahrir it seemed like a big party. It seemed like everybody was happy, everybody was very proud of what they have achieved, what they had achieved. It was a fantastic atmosphere. I mean, anything was enough almost to have a party in the streets. I also remember I was on a conference, people were speaking, of course, English and Arabic, and the translator almost cried when she was translating the Arab witnesses or the Egyptian witnesses of what happened on Tahrir Square. It was a fantastic moment of honeymoon. Of course, honeymoons come to an end. And so phase 1 started, the rule of the moderates. After the elections in Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco, as you know, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power. But when they came to power, even that moment was still being felt as almost a honeymoon moment. People were sometimes shocked about this huge victory of Islamists, but at the same time, taxi drivers were listening in the taxi to the parliament on the radio. People in the street who were living in the street, they had these little radios and they were all sitting together to listen to what members of parliament were discussing. We had new constitutions. And people believed that the revolution might still work in a moderate way. And of course, you saw this rise of the Muslim Brotherhood everywhere. You saw them as the main faction in the Syrian opposition. In Jordan also, and was the only party. In the UAE, in Yemen, you saw new reforms being started. Believe it or not, but even in the Emirates, they were thinking within the government to start a kind of democratic process on the local level, something that ended pretty soon on the moment I'm gonna explain. In Libya, there were great elections. There were fair, honest elections in which, for once, the Muslim Brotherhood did not win, but the National Forces Alliance of Mahmoud Jibril, who was the guest speaker of the second lecture here. They won the elections in 2012 and 2014. And when you came in Libya around that time, there was no army, there was no police, but there was no crime. There was people were just living together. So this moment of moderation was still a kind of an extension of this honeymoon period. Of course, at that moment, also Turkey and certainly Erdogan saw himself as the new leader of the Arab world because his friends of the Muslim Brotherhood were being elected everywhere. He came to visit Cairo and Tunis, and people were waiting on the roads from the airport to the city and were singing Erdogan, Salah Eddin, so the big conqueror, the big victor of the Arab world. But at the same time, that was the case in Egypt, in Tunisia, everywhere. Whoever won the elections, you still had these revolutionary groups who were playing the watchdog. I mean, they wanted to keep the revolutionary ideals. And when a government was not doing what they were standing for, they hit the street again. Tahrir was full again. The streets of Tunis were full again. And actually, I mean, I lived through that period in Egypt, and although I might not be the biggest fan of the Muslim Brotherhood, now we can say it was a period of freedom, of free speech. People like comics, like Bassem Youssef could go on TV and laugh at the president every single day. I mean, it was the most watched program in Egypt. But something snapped at a certain point, and that was an extremely, extremely important moment. In November, the end of November 2011, Koert was threatening to shut down parliament and so also shut down the constitutional process in Egypt. What did the government, what did Morsi do? He said, in order to avoid this, I'm going to take all power for a short period of time to push the constitution through, and then we'll see. But this moment that the president of Egypt, being a Muslim Brotherhood, being not very much trusted by revolutionary groups, and of course not by, let's say, the old regime or what they call the Völkel, they saw this as what they have always feared, a power grab, a coup by the Muslim Brotherhood. On that moment, I just came back from Jordan, where I joined protests for democratic reform in Amman. The moment that Morsi took that decision, all protests stopped in Jordan. They didn't want to go to reform and democracy anymore because they thought, then we will have the same as what they are seeing in Egypt. That moment, Ennahda, the Muslim Brotherhood party, even not officially, in Tunisia, understood that they had to work with everyone, not to try to take power in the next elections. So they took a different strategy. In Syria, where the Muslim Brotherhood was the most important and sometimes very arrogant partner in the opposition, suddenly they lost all credibility and all legitimacy. The impact of that moment was enormous, not only for the Muslim Brotherhood in the Arab world, but also for the reaction against it, because it was the start of what Egyptians call a second revolution, what others call a coup against the Muslim Brotherhood. In any case, at that moment, a movement arose against the power of the Muslim Brotherhood. Here you see a nice picture of these two most powerful people who think the same, who thought more or less. Erdogan from Turkey and Morsi from Egypt. Here I'm going to come into difficult waters. In Egypt, this reaction led to massive protests, and on the 3rd of July 2013, Morsi was kicked out of power by millions of people in the street, but eventually by the army, and who was the leader of the army, current President Abdel Fattah Sisi. The signal, I mean, we cannot say that from that point, and I will come back to that, from that point, Egypt went into a reign of terror and virtue, but the importance of the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Arab world was the signal it gave to Islamists that coming to a, let's say, an Islamic society through democracy, which was the strategy of the Muslim Brotherhood, eventually led to nothing. that was the signal the fall of Morsi gave to other Islamists. And this led to an explosion of extremist groups, for example, in Syria, and it also led to the Islamic State, because there was no other way of achieving what they wanted. So people, certainly from the Arab world, and the ones who were supporting Morsi much more than in Europe, they were going to say, okay, now this is the only way to fight for our ideals, and this is the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. So the Islamic State started to pop up in Iraq, in Syria, in Sinai, in Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. And just like Robespierre, you know the terror of the Islamic State, you know the what they want, the virtue thinking, but actually it reminds a lot of what Robespierre was doing. I mean, what people sometimes forget during Robespierre is that he installed the cult of the supreme being. He was cleaning the streets of people who were thinking differently. I mean, he installed a new calendar. He renamed streets and new squares, and it was forbidden to gamble. It was forbidden to be drunk. It was sexual irregularities, whatever it might be, were forbidden. And it was also forbidden to display wealth or other things. So it was a state of terror, and exactly the state of terror that was also organized by the Islamic State, being it, of course, in one great worse. The decapitations, as you know, and the reign of terror was, of course, not only in Syria, but, I mean, I think we have to put the war in Syria somewhere, so I put it here. Right now, 500,000 people have been killed. But why does it fit in this story is, when I was in Syria in 2013, several times, in January 2013, there were no ISIS fighters. ISIS did not exist. Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda group, hardly existed. They were founded, but they hardly existed. When you were walking around, you saw very moderate people. I mean, they would fit into the rule of the moderates within the opposition. They wanted democracy. And I remember on the 15th of March, 2013, the general commander of the Free Syrian Army gave a message, which was on video, you can watch it on YouTube, in which he said, "We are fighting for a free and democratic Syria for all Syrians. Whatever your religion is, wherever you come from, we fight for all Syrians." The problem is that because of lack of backing and sometimes lack of organization, the space for extremist groups was growing. And because of also the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood within the opposition of Syria, the space for the radicals, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so forth, became that great that I, even in my last visit, could see them growing. You could see these guys, you could see on the ground how the revolution of Syria was changing. One unfortunate pic of these peoples. Let's go to phase 3, the Thermidor. While ISIS was merely, let's say, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and partly Sinai, we can say that in Egypt, after the revolutionary coup, or coup revolution of 3 July, people had the feeling that freedom was coming back. But at the same time, white terror came back. That was installed as well. 60,000 people were put in prison in the months after 3 July. During a sit-in in Rabat by the Muslim Brotherhood, which was cleaned in one single day, the 14th of August 2013, 1,800 people were killed, unnecessarily killed. The Thermidor also went to other countries, let's say the counter-revolution. In Tunisia, Nida Tunis, which was composed of people from the old regime of Ben Ali, got to power, became the biggest party. And in Jordan and Morocco, the wave of reforms promised by both kings actually stopped. The face of the Thermidor is, of course, Abdel Fattah Sisi, who was back then promoted as Field Marshal of Egypt, actually without ever having fought any war. So now we're coming to the Arab, what we say, the end of phase of the revolution. The strong men are back. Sisi in Egypt, we see Haftar in Libya, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, in Saudi Arabia, who is jailing whoever he wants, he's doing whatever he wants. Assad seems to remain in Syria. That's how it seems to be so far. And Erdogan seems to remain, Putin-wise, in Turkey. But the question is, has the revolution really ended? Let me go back to the French Revolution and to the causes of the French Revolution. Probably the main cause of the revolution in France was a demographic explosion. France went in the years, let's say from 1700 to 1789, from 20 to 30 million, which in those days, I mean, the demographic explosion started back then. So people were not used to these kind of explosions. It was massive. And if you have such a demographic explosion, it means that your population is extremely young. If you have a young population, young people, they want to build a future. They want something, they want a life. They want work, and they want to dream. But if the social and economic system is completely stuck, then you cannot live your dream. And that was exactly the case in France. Nice jobs were all had to be bought, or it was from father to son that it went. So the other sons in this explosion, they were all unemployed. Another reason to see a failed dream. There was a massive amount of corruption from the part of the state. In order to survive, people had to do crazy things, I mean, which was then, of course, punished by police brutality. In France, as you know, there was a lack of freedom. Since 1685, the evocation of the Edict of Nantes, there was no religious freedom. So all the Protestants had to leave the country. You were all Catholic or you were persecuted in France. And of course, there were no political rights. The assembly and the third estate, which had to represent the people, wasn't assembled for more than a century. So when it was assembled then in 1989, of course, that was a moment when everything exploded. Also interesting in the French Revolution was that there was a new way of circulating ideas. Until the revolution in France, there was only one newspaper in France. And the news was, of course, state-driven, state-oriented. So people got the news the state wanted. When the revolution started, every serious revolutionary wanted to have his own newspaper. And for the first time in history, newspapers were sold on the streets, on the corners in Paris. So suddenly new ideas were put on paper and were spread like wildfire. So this was the first time that new ideas were being fought, debated all the time, and this was an essential part of the revolution. And here I give two examples. L'Ami du Peuple, who was the newspaper of Marat. You know Marat because of this famous painting of Jean-Louis David, who was killed in his bath. So while having, let's say, something written on the paper then. And the other one, Le Vieux Cordelier, you see Par, so it's just one person who was writing his own newspaper. Camille Desmoulins, who was a friend of Robespierre, but during the terror period, he was also decapitated by Robespierre. So let's go back now to, or ahead now, to the Arab Revolution. There has also been going on a massive demographic explosion. The Arab population, in the 20th century alone, the Arab population multiplied by more than 5-fold. Just to give an example, in Egypt, every 6 months, there are 1 million Egyptians more. During the 5 years I lived in Egypt, the population went from 90 million to 100 million. The median age in the Arab world is 24, which is extremely young. And this is the age, as you know, that you have dreams. You want to become someone. You want to do something with your life. But then again, what we have seen, and by the way, still see in the Arab world, is that the social, economic system is stuck. There is not a lot of evolution. Even today, the economy is doing worse even than before 2011. So there's a massive amount of unemployment. And perhaps you know, or you don't know, but if you want to be married in Egypt, you need an apartment. In order to have an apartment, you need a job. And if you're not married, forget about sexual intercourse, or almost forget about it. So you can understand the frustration if you don't have a job. I mean, a lot of things are being bad in your life, and certainly your dreams are not going to come out. Obviously, there's also a massive amount of corruption. There is police brutality. There's lack of freedom. There was lack of political rights. There's no accident that people during the revolution went to the street and asked for freedom, justice, and bread. Exactly the three things that were not available or hardly available in Egypt. And the point is, if we are looking today, 7 years later, the causes are still there. Even worse, I mean, as the population is still growing, I mean, even more rapidly than they were growing before 2011, I mean, the problem is only getting bigger. Schools are getting worse. I mean, in most schools, you have classes of 70 people. These 70 people, the teacher is underpaid. So he's not teaching anything. So he says to the pupils, you have to come after school to my house for extra teachings. So at least you can read and write, but the parents have to pay for it. So in some schools, you even have 2 shifts of 70 people in one class. I mean, so the entire system is cracking down. And after the revolution, unfortunately, these causes haven't changed. On the contrary. And equally interesting, as in the French Revolution, is that there is new media. The circulation of ideas. Debate is going on, not through newspapers, but through Facebook and Twitter. You all know the Facebook page, We Are All Khaled Said, who was exposing police brutality with the picture of the deformed face of Khaled Said, who had been beaten to death by the police in Alexandria. This Facebook page was sharing information, making people conscious of what they actually already knew, but they were becoming angry. But also in a later stage, it was used as an organizing tool. On these pages, people said, we are now going to Tahrir, join us. So, and Twitter is still a place of debate. You see Wael Ghonim, who was the owner of Khaled Said page. We see Shari Hamid of Brookings Institute, Sultan Al-Qasemi with 300,000 followers from the Emirates. These people were reacting to each other, were debating ideas and so forth. And although we can see right now that repression is back, strong leaders are back, I mean, these ideas are unstoppable. And these ideas and this debate is still going on. Actually, what we are seeing about this debate is that it is only beginning. And the essential big debate that is only starting in the Arab world is the debate, what is the relationship between the individual, the state, and religion? Exactly the same debate that was at the heart of the revolution in France. And if I say this debate has only started, you can see it flaring up now and then. You can see these debates going on. But what the state is doing, even though they, for example, Sisi in Egypt was saying, like, oh, we need a new kind of Islam, so let's have some debate about it. And there was one debate on TV with two clerics from Al-Azhar, academics or whatever from Al-Azhar, and a journalist who said other things than they liked. Then then he was in the end convicted for blasphemy and spent 3 years in jail for debating Islam and society. So the state doesn't like this. Now Mohammed bin Salman says, okay, the Wahhabi Islam that we have seen in Saudi Arabia was a kind of a deviation of what we were really thinking, which is actually true because it has become far more conservative after 79 than it was before 79. But will he allow a debate? But that debate is going on and will not stop. So my conclusion, if you like, or premature conclusion perhaps, is that if you compare the Arab Revolution with the phases of Koert Brinton, being aware that we are talking about different countries with different speeds of what was happening, sometimes things going into war, or others had second revolutions, but that the pattern fits. I mean, this is a revolution. And if France had to do 86 years and 14 constitutions to go from revolution in 1789 until a stable democracy with the Third Republic in 75. I mean, calling the Arab Spring an Arab winter or the Arab Revolution an Arab failure after 7 years, I think that is premature. Of course, I do not hope and think that we have to wait for another 80 years or 79 years before we will see real democracy in the Arab world. But what I'm convinced is that the young people that we have seen hitting the streets in Morocco, in Egypt, in Syria or Iran, these people are not going away. Their dreams are not going away. So sooner or later, they will hit the street again and ask the rights they deserve, and the rights I think everyone in the world deserves. So that's why I'm convinced we will see this protest soon again, and then eventually, let's hope, or as they say, inshallah, it will lead to a free and democratic Arab world. Thank you very much.